Thanks everyone for coming to what is the final and fourth seminar in our series on Beyond Cooking, Global Histories of Food Making and Gender Across the Early Modern World. My name is Melissa Calaresu, and Marta Manzanares and I are the co-organizers of this seminar series and also a conference. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Cecilia Leong-Salobir, who's an honorary research fellow at the University of Western Australia. In fact, Cecilia and Kathleen are in Western and Eastern Australia, respectively, at 6 and 8 p.m. In the evening. Cecilia is a food historian, and she researches on colonial food history and the food history of Asia and Australia. And she has a number of monographs in the field, and an important edited book on the Routledge Handbook of Food in Asia. Her current project is on the global history of Hakka food. So I'll pass it on to Cecilia, who's going to chair the session today. Thank you.
Hello, good morning to you all from Western Australia, although it is 6 o'clock in the evening here. Our first paper is on Betelnut and love magic in early colonial Manila, by Stephanie Mawson from the University of Cambridge. Stephanie is currently a research fellow at St. John's College in Cambridge. Later this year, she will be starting a new position as a researcher at the Institute of Social Sciences in Lisbon. How exciting. Her work focuses on the contested nature of empire in maritime Southeast Asia during the 17th century. Her upcoming book, Fugitives, Apostates and Rebels, The Limits of Spanish Empire in the 17th Century Philippines, is under contract with Cornell University Press. So Stephanie.
Great. So I've just shared my screen. I hope that you can see that. Nodding. Okay, good. Perfect. So hang on a minute. So yeah, I just wanted to begin by thanking Marta and Melissa for putting together such a fantastic program. I've really enjoyed listening and learning so much about food history from different cultural perspectives. I guess I feel maybe a little bit like an interloper here because I'm not actually a food historian, but even more so because what I'm going to talk about today, which is betelnut, isn't actually a food so much as a chewed stimulant. And my acquaintance with betelnut developed indirectly via my research into folk magic in the early colonial Philippines. So what I'm going to present here today is not so much the product of an in-depth study of betelnut itself, but more its relationship to broader questions about cultural and religious practices on the colonial frontier. And I'll draw out some of those conclusions towards the end to show what the hidden dynamics behind betelnut use in love potions tells us about social relations in colonial Manila. So I guess many people who've traveled in Asia might be familiar with betelnut as it's still very commonly used across large parts of Southeast Asia and also in parts of the Pacific. The betelnut is actually a combination of several different things. So the main ingredient is the areca nut, and that's in fact actually a fruit and not a nut. And this is dried and then sliced finely before being wrapped in betel leaves. And then it's usually mixed with lime and also often with tobacco and sometimes with other spices to add flavor. So in the Philippines, this mixture is called buyo in the Tagalog language. So buyo or betelnut is consumed by chewing, and it characteristically gives its users red saliva that stains the mouth. And I guess it has its equivalent in other cultures with something like coca leaves in Peru or yerba mate in Argentina, or indeed in coffee for most of us in the West. And it's typically used to stave off hunger or to provide a boost in energy. Unlike coffee and coca leaves, it's also highly addictive. In the Philippines, buyo was an extremely important part of many cultural activities prior to colonization, and it was a common part of religious and familial ceremonies, and often gifted to solidify friendship or as part of courtship culture between men and women. In the colonial period, it became one of the most common ingredients in love charms, and so that's how I first began to pay attention to it when I was trawling through Inquisition records relating to folk magic practices in Manila. And I guess that's what I'm going to focus here on today. So the presence of buyo and love charms in Manila helps us to explore the way in which Indigenous and European cultures became entangled in the early modern period. I'm going to begin here by giving a brief history of betel nut use in the Philippines before moving on to its place within colonial forms of love charms and other types of folk magic. And I'll then end by discussing the ways in which this was subversive of colonial control, engendering a backlash from Spanish missionaries over the purity of religious devotion in Manila in the 17th century. So betel nut has a long history within the Philippines, with archaeological evidence that the plant was in use in the islands as early as 3000 BCE. And this suggests that the usage developed independently but in parallel to other parts of Asia. Despite this, we actually only have limited historical research on the tradition in the Philippines. So we have 13th century trade records that suggest that betel was a common forest resource that islanders traded with Chinese merchants in exchange for porcelain, textiles, and other valuable trade goods. But at present, the best source of information for pre-Hispanic use of betel nut actually comes from early Spanish observers who noted both how commonplace it was and how it had been incorporated into local religious customs. So Pedro Chirino, for instance, noted that buyo was often used by Filipinos when preparing bodies for burial. The juice of the buyo was smeared on the body and then placed inside the mouth. And Chirino speculated that betel nut juice may have had preservative powers. So this meant that the body would not decompose so quickly, allowing families to keep their relatives inside their houses in wooden caskets. Similarly, in 1624, Captain Alonso